So the Yoga Sutra, what are they all about? What is the chief idea? What do they mean? And what do you need to know out of the starting gate as a primer? In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite yoga texts, which is called the Yoga Sutras and of Patanjali, and look at the key heart of this text and what you need to know. So the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali were composed, we might say, nearly 2,000 years ago. So one date we could throw out there is like 200 Common Era. And the Yoga Sutra was part of a whole kind of slew of schools that were rising up. So this was kind of like the text for the what we might call classical yoga school, which was the school of meditation. And at this time in history, other schools were kind of also emerging and developing their philosophies, and it was very sophisticated. But this is the one we're interested in because it has to do with yoga and the practical act of meditation as a pathway to self-understanding and self-realization. So what's this text all about? So when we hear about the Yoga Sutras, often many of you will think of, rightfully so, something called the 8 limbs. Now the 8 limbs occurs kind of later in the book. And really, we don't want to start with the 8 limbs. That's kind of like another tool set he gives us. Really what we want to start with is right at the beginning and the first few sutras of the text. So that's what we are going to take a look at today. So the Yoga Sutras, I should also mention, it's called of Patanjali, but we don't really know who that was. Was Patanjali a real person? Was he a group of people? Was he just representative of this philosophical school? Who knows? But it's the wisdom tradition of the time. And even though we talk about texts and things being written, what we also want to keep in mind is that at this time, things were not written down. Most of the population wasn't literate. Wisdom was transmitted orally. So that's why the Yoga Sutra, sutra meaning thread, are these little aphorisms, these little tiny phrases that you can memorize, right? But that thread pointed to a bigger idea, you know. So over the years, there's been many interpretations of the Yoga Sutras and what these little aphorisms mean. So I mention that because we'll talk about text in a little bit, but when you're reading the Yoga Sutras, it's good to know, obviously, I don't speak Sanskrit. Maybe you do, probably not. Just for us to be aware that there is a translation process going on. So if you pick up your, Yoga Sutra text and you're reading it, it's good actually to look at a couple different translations, because then you get an idea of like, oh, how is this translator interpreting this? What lens are they putting on this? Because sometimes you can really see there's a big filter there. For example, in the BKS Iyengar text, a lot of the Yoga Sutras is filtered through this idea of the physical practice, right? Because that's, of course, his interest, and that's how he's experiencing it. So that's useful, but it's good for us to remember that all of these, if we're reading it in English, friends, it's an interpretation. So it's a translation, and also there's necessarily some interpretation going on. So that said, let's dive in. So the first sutra, Atta Yoga Nushasanam, and guys, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so my pronunciation may not be perfection, but that's the general gist. Atta Yoga Nushasanam means now the exposition of yoga is being made. Now the exposition of yoga. And this is kind of how these texts would start. It's like, now we're talking about yoga. Now, here it is in this moment. This is, and there's a kind of an idea of, hey, this is the real deal. Because if you remember back, there's all those different schools, right, with all their ideas of what, like, how do you find enlightenment, or what's the path to truth? Well, hey, they're going, the yoga people are going like, now this, we're talking about yoga. You'll notice I'm flashing this text around a lot. This is just kind of my standard go-to. I find that it's like super straightforward, clear, easy to understand, without a lot of that kind of interpretive stuff that we might see, beautiful as it may be in some of the other texts. All right, so there we go. Now we're going to talk about yoga, is basically how it starts. Now. And don't you love how that just really brings you into the present moment too? The word now. Now we're going to talk about yoga. We're going to explain what yoga is. Okay. Now, at the beginning of this, you could almost think of this as a thesis paper, right? So the second sutra, my marked up book, the second sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So that's like the summation of this book. And that means that yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. Let's break that down. Yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. So this one, and basically, if we could just walk away from the text at this point and be like, oh, yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. So my mind stuff, the chitta, right? All of that, the chitta, the thoughts, the emotions, all that habitual, I call them hamsters, right? All the little hamsters, you know, like running around in your head, like on their little wheels. Like, what happened yesterday with Susan at the water cooler? Like those are all the hamsters, right? So that's the mind stuff. And it's also those feelings that kind of habitually come up in us. So he calls them, you know, the chitta, the consciousness, the vritti, the rolling of the mind stuff. We'll call them hamsters, okay? Friendly little hamsters, mean little hamsters running around all over the place. So yoga is the restraint of all of those hamster noises. Now, some of these texts will translate it as yoga is the cessation of all that stuff. This is why I like this text. Yoga is the restraint of the modifications, he calls them, not fluctuations, but you get the idea of the mind stuff. I like restraint because honestly, folks, the mind is its own little beast, right? It's like a little wild, again, animal kingdom in there with all these little creatures running around. And we can't always just make them stop. So I like this interpretation of restraint of the crazy hamsters. So when we start to restrain those crazy ass hamsters, that's yoga, right? So it's a process and it's also the result. It's the process of restraining the mind stuff, and it's also, hey, the state of being that happens when those hamsters are quiet, right? So let's keep reading because the first couple of sutras here really lay it all out. But again, like if I could get it, oh, yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. Oh, great. I would read no further. Got it, Patanjali. Thanks. But I need to read further because I don't quite get it yet. Okay. So he says, Tada drashtu svarupe vashtanam. So sutra number 3, then the seer abides in his own nature. So he's saying yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. Then the seer, the witness, the seer, that's your internal state, not some, you know, like prophet on a mountainside, but your own witness, then your presence abides in its own nature, in its true self, right? And then sutra number 4, otherwise, the self appears to assume the forms of the mental modifications. So let's just break that down. Yoga is when we restrain the fluctuations of the mind stuff. Then you experience who you really are. Otherwise, you think you're all your crazy hamsters, right? And don't we do this? Like we walk around during the day going like think about some of the hamsters, the common thought patterns that come up in your mind, you know, like, oh my gosh, I should have done this. I am a bad person. Oh my gosh, I did this. I'm a good person. You know, oh, I want this in the future. Oh, I regret this in the past. These are all those mental modifications or the emotions that come up, you know, that we might feel, whether it's, I feel anxious, I tend to feel sad, I feel depressed, I feel excited, I feel nervous. All of these churnings are part of the hamster mind, right? And Patanjali says, when we're able to restrain those, when those can get quiet, then we experience our true nature, because otherwise we think we're just all of those stories. We think we're all of those narratives that we tell ourselves about ourselves and our world. We mistake our true self with that. And don't we do that all the time? So just think about it for a sec. Like, you know, we have these things we say like, I am a good worker. I am a good mom. I am a good dad. I am patient. I am loving. I am kind. I am impatient. All of those, Patanjali would say, all of that is just kind of like identifications with the wrong stuff. So when you sit and you let the hamsters take a nap, right? They go, right? And we can feel like with clarity, that stillness, that beingness, not distracted by all the vrittis, the modifications, the churning, the hamsters. And that's who we really are. So we are in a case of mistaken identity all the time, most of us, where we're like attaching our sense of self and our identity to all of this nonsense rather than to that still place that exists behind all the fluctuations of the mind. So take a moment, come and sit for just a moment. And this is why meditation as a practice in the Yoga Sutras, I mean, he gives us lots of tools for how to do this, but this kind of explains why that's so important. Because when we can sit and still ourselves, then we're like, oh, we're right there. And you guys, and this isn't like some elusive, far off state, like, oh, I have to reach this transcendental meditation state. No, no, no. It's just like, hey, can you just let the mind stuff settle a little bit? And then you'll be in yoga. And that's it. And it's actually, it's not far away from us. All right, so come and sit. Take a nice tall seat. You can sit in a chair, you can sit on blankets, whatever. If it's hard to sit, feel free to lay down. We're just giving ourselves a couple of moments here of repose. So go ahead and like roll your shoulders back or make whatever movements you need to do so that you can start to settle into the space of your body. And then let your eyes close if that's comfortable for you, just so we can begin to bring our awareness more inside. Begin to transition from thinking to being. And become like an observer, a witness to your thoughts. So step back so you can begin to watch sensations, thoughts, feelings kind of arise into your awareness. But rather than following or chasing or attaching to those thoughts, let yourself kind of settle back into the space of watching. Eckhart Tolle says, be like a little cat sitting outside of a little mouse hole, waiting, curious about what mouse is going to pop out, where the mouse is the thought. So wait and watch. Allow yourself to relax into the warm, open space of your own presence. Take a deep breath in and let it go and let your eyes open. And so, how was that for you? So some days our mind, our hamsters are really freaking busy, right? They're like building a civilization or something like that. And it's really hard to make that transition to settling into being. And then other days it's kind of like, oh, my thoughts are naturally a little passive, a little bit more settled, and it's easy to set into that state. But that's it, you guys, that's yoga. So yoga, chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the restraint of those crazy modifications, fluctuations of the mind, the hamsters. Because when we restrain them, or when we let them kind of be, then we can connect to our true nature. And Patanjali would say that beingness, that sense of the witness, the experiencer behind the experience, that's who you really are. And all that other stuff is changeable, right? So our identities change, we're a mom, first we're not a mom and then we have a kid and we're a mom, or same thing with being a parent, or we have a job and we let go of a job, or we identify with certain things. Those are all changeable. And Patanjali says that changeable stuff, that's not really where it's at. Your true self, the deep, true, whole self is actually the witness of those things. Right? Another way that we can think of this is you can think about a common way to describe this would be the sky and the clouds, right? Or the ocean and the waves. So if you imagine an ocean, right? Imagine this beautiful kind of like lake, actually, let's say, and imagine that there's tons of waves. So the wind is kind of like all those vrittis, those churning thoughts, our hamsters, right? Racing all over the place, making a big mess. And when the vrittis are really activated, then you can't see into that lake, right? It's cloudy, it's muddy, it's all churned up. But when the lake is calm, right? That's when we still the fluctuations of our mind. Then that lake becomes a reflection of the sky, which is the big expansive self, right? So we as humans, we're always in this dance of like crazy, 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 hamster, 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 rah! And then going like, oh no, I'm a universal being of light and wholeness and presence, right? So that's the dance that we play. All right, so those are just the first 4 Yoga Sutra, and they kind of tell the whole story. And then everything else in this book is Patanjali's way of helping us along the path, right? So he offers us more explanations, right? Right after this, he goes into, hey, let me tell you what the vrittis are, and breaks them down and gives us tools for how to practice. So the book is related to this first primary intent, which is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the restraint of all the fluctuations of the mind. So everything kind of points back to that key idea. So if you take one thing away from our little chat today, it's that yoga is the restraint of your hamsters, right? Because when we do that, we experience our true nature, and we can start to discriminate between all the crazy stories we tell ourselves and our true selves, which gives us more flexibility in our lives, right? If I don't have to be so attached to the stories that my mind churns up at a moment's notice, I can start to be more centered and grounded and present in my life, rather than being carried away on all these narratives. Yoga can become part of the fabric of what I'm doing every day. So before we close, just a little bit of a note on translations. This is not exhaustive. This is just my pile of books. So the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Swami Satchidananda. This was the one I got in my first teacher training. I find him super practical and straightforward, easy to understand. So I love this translation for the sutras. Swami Pravananda and Christopher Isherwood, How to Know God. So this one is a nice little read. It's been a while since I've read this one. So this one's pretty straightforward and I think very sweet. Easy to understand as well. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Hartranft, he kind of puts them together. Is a good one to check out. A little bit more cerebral, I think. Honorable mention, Edwin Bryant, for those of you academics out there. Edwin Bryant has a very hefty tome, which I just don't happen to have on my shelf, which if you want to kind of go deep, he's a little bit more complex. So I would use that maybe as a second translation. I think you should have more than one translation, because you want to kind of be able to look at it and say, like, how did this guy do it? How did this guy do it? I mentioned Iyengar earlier. He's got a version of the Yoga Sutras, which is, again, it's more, I found it to be a little bit more, filtered by the physical asana practice, but that's what Iyengar did. That's what he's amazing for. So that could be a useful one. The Heart of Yoga by Desikachar. He has translations in the back. These are a little bit, they're a little bit translated. In other words, there's a little bit of a filter to them, but it's very beautiful, and he's was very esteemed as a yogi. And again, it's and what I love about this is, like, he has he famously said, like, yoga, the quality of your yoga practice is in your relationships. I'm paraphrasing, but rather than down dog. And so lovely teacher. And this, if you can find it, this was a gift to me, and it's a compilation of translations. Wow. If you can find this, it's wonderful, because for each of the sutras, you get a different interpretation. And so this is like an all-in-one book, which I love because you can see how different translators have approached the same text, which when we're studying a different language, by looking at a whole bunch of translations, you can see like, oh, what's the consistent word that they use? How is this person kind of bending this a little bit for their intention? So I love this. So this has tons of translations from Vivekananda, from Satchidananda is in here. Jörg Fierstein is in here, a wonderful scholar, and his translation is in here as well. Anyways, there's tons of there's good stuff in this book. So if you can find this one is also a great translation. So there you have it, a little primer on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a really wonderful text, certainly not the only yoga text. And one thing we do want to keep in mind is that when Patanjali was composing or compiling these sutras, is that yoga was meditation. So one thing to keep in mind is that a physical practice for yoga didn't emerge until like past the Middle Ages, right? Hatha yoga, which is far later development. For much of its origin story, yoga is about meditation and really about controlling or becoming familiar with our minds, being empowered over what's going on in our minds so we can connect to who we really are. And the physical yoga practice and all of the breathing techniques and asana techniques that have come up that we're so familiar with are really just tools for this intention, right? Ultimately, yoga is not a practice for your body. The body is a tool, is a vehicle in order to get to the state of beingness and self-realization. That's yoga. So this is a wonderful place to explore some of these origins of yoga and meditation and kind of the heart of yoga, what's behind it. So I encourage you to check it out. All right, you guys, if this was helpful to you, please subscribe for more goodies, and wonderful to share some space philosophically with you today. And I'll see you on the mat.